One of the things we hear all the time is, why would anyone want my data? Why would anyone want to attack me? They almost all have the same big three needs. Number one is an asset inventory. They don't really know what they've got in their manufacturing spaces. They don't know all the PLCs and HMIs and smart transmitters and things they have in the environment. Number two, they're lacking risk management we talked about. They don't know how to quantify cyber risk and especially cyber risk to their environment. And then the third big one is process and procedure.
Welcome to Manufacturing Insiders. Today I have Joe Cody with me today. Joe is a really high-level expert in cybersecurity. He's the Director of OT Cybersecurity for EIS, which is a global provider of MES and cybersecurity services. And they serve some really, really notable big clients throughout the country. What we want to talk about today is some really overlooked aspects of cybersecurity. A lot of manufacturers, they have a firewall. They think they're all set up with, cybersecurity, but they're overlooking some really key areas that Joe is going to explain to us. And this is really any kind of company. Any kind of company that's doing manufacturing probably has overlooked cybersecurity issues out there. So welcome to Manufacturing Insider, Joe.
Thanks, Nate. How's it going?
It's going great. One other note that I wanted to just throw out before I get too far into it, if you're listening to this podcast and you're interested in joining your leader in manufacturing, you'd like to share insights on the podcast, just go to manufacturinginsiders.com, fill out the form there, and I'll jump on a call with you and we can do a little pre-interview and hopefully get you on the podcast. So let's get into it, Joe. What are people missing in manufacturing with cybersecurity?
So the first thing I want to point out is we focus on OT cybersecurity, right? Operational technology. So our focus really isn't on the business systems, the accounting systems, the desktops in your office. Our focus is really more on the computers, the PLCs, the controllers, everything that's involved in making your widgets, right? Those widgets might be boxes, they might be steel, it might be refined crude oil, right? So we're really focused on that piece of it. And that, one of the things we've seen in manufacturing, and I'm sure you've seen it with your customers, is the push for more information from the factory floor, right?
Right.
Whether that's to improve efficiency, reduce downtime, or really just your decision makers needing more real-time data at their fingers to do what they do.
Right.
Along with that, the problem comes is that bad guys and bad guys is a broad term, right? But these people want that information as well, either to steal things from you or to just cause chaos in your environment. Right. So as there's been this big push for getting this data up, one of the things that tends to get overlooked is we need to secure that too. The data is stored down there and the data is moving up. So that's a real big focus that we're paying attention to these days.
I see. And I think there's probably some people out there, some manufacturers, maybe in a small CNC job shop or, just a 4 or 5, 6 guy operation that might think to themselves, what data do I really have that someone cares about? Do you run into that a lot?
Yeah. One of the big things I get, and it doesn't matter if it's, a 5-person shop or it's a 50,000 person shop. One of the things we hear all the time is, why would anyone want my data? Why would anyone want to attack me? And I talk a lot of times about one of the things that makes OT cybersecurity, I guess, such a big issue is there's three assumptions or fallacies in cybersecurity. And the very first one is what you just hit on. I think people underestimate how important their data or processes would be in a bad actor's hands. That data could be your personnel records, right? It could just be information about your employees, information about your customers, right? Whether that's to blackmail you or to pose as you to try to trick somebody into issuing an invoice to them or a purchase order to them, that data is really valuable. On the other end of the spectrum, when we deal with life sciences companies or companies that have intellectual property, obviously that data is huge. right? Some of these life sciences, these pharmaceutical companies, they have patented intellectual property that's worth literal billions to them.
Right.
And if somebody got their hands on that, whether it's the recipe to make that, or even just the information about what ingredients are in a drug or in a particular formulation, and they dump that on the public internet, that patent is essentially worthless at that point in time. So people seriously underestimate the value that their information has to an outsider.
Right. Okay. So let's take kind of a traditional job shop that's I really like to kind of start with, because AI, automation, all these topics are really hot topics in the manufacturing space. A lot of guys out there kind of trying to sort through where do I need to look first. And what I always say, I'm not the expert, but this is from experts I've talked to, is data collection is the first step. You got to have data to work with if you're going to analyze and use AI to create efficiencies in your process. Where do you typically see the most flagrant oversights in data collection and transfer inside of a typical operation?
So we work to standards, right? I never assume that something that I tell you is just take my word as gospel and trust me because I've been doing this a long time. And so we follow standards like NIST, we follow ISO, we follow ISA and IEC, a lot of 3-letter agencies, 4-letter agencies that your viewers are going to be familiar with.
Mm.
Every one of those, they look at data predominantly in 2 states, data at rest and data in transit, right? So particularly, AI is a huge deal, right? Your AI models are only as good as the data that you train them on.
Right.
And that data sits somewhere. Maybe it's in the cloud, maybe it's on databases, file servers, whatnot in your environment. And if you have to protect that data, it needs to be, and ideally it's encrypted where it's sitting at rest. You're restricting who has access to it, right? And that could be read as well as write. Like we said, your intellectual property, if it's in there, just somebody being able to view that data could be damaging to you. So don't just assume because nobody can write to it, it's not in trouble. So there's keywords and tricky phrases we talk about: identity and access management, IAM. Making sure that only the right people have access to that data, only the right people can write to that data. There's it's kind of the holy trinity in cybersecurity. We call it the CIA Triad. In particular, when you're talking about data, we think of that. There's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And confidentiality means making sure that only authorized people can view the data that or systems that you're talking about. Integrity is that only authorized people can modify the data or system that you're talking about. And availability is that the system or data is available when you need it, it's ready to you. In IT, that's the order of priority: confidentiality, integrity, availability. In OT or in manufacturing, where we're mainly worried about making sure our processes stay up and running, we flip that a little bit. We say availability is king, then integrity, and then confidentiality is last. And if you think about that for a second, it kind of makes sense, right? If you think about an ATM, I think most of us would rather the ATM be unavailable rather than have just anybody be able to come in and look at our balance or certainly take money out. Whereas on the other side, when we think about OT systems, a production machine or production line, we'd probably be okay with potential data leakage or a little less security if we can keep that line up and running. Doesn't mean we ignore the confidentiality and integrity. We just bump the availability up a little bit.
Right. So how do you strike that balance?
Wow. One of the biggest pieces of any cybersecurity program is a risk management program, right?
Okay.
I'm a big advocate of risk management. And at its core basic principle, risk is comprised of 2 components: impact and probability, right? Impact is if this situation happened, if the worst thing happened to us, what would that do to our business? That could be, especially in manufacturing environments, that could be a health or safety or environmental impact. Certainly could be a financial impact, right? And then the other thing we look at is, well, how likely is this to happen? And, if we're in Chicago or we're in Detroit, and we're looking at the likelihood of a hurricane, not very likely. but the likelihood of a blizzard, much more likely. So we use those two factors, impact and probability, to come up with a risk score. And that really needs to be your deciding factor for every organization. And every organization and every system is going to have a different risk score. And you use that to kind of guide your priorities, your prioritization, and your decision-making process around, okay, when have we gone too far in slacking off or allowing confidentiality or integrity to fall a little bit in the name of availability?
Right. Okay. So can you think of like a good story to kind of illustrate? Well, I guess first of all, when you engage a customer, typically because they had a problem occur, or because they're being proactive and they're trying to prevent problems from occurring?
It's more of the first, right?
Okay.
A lot of what we get engaged with is someone has done an assessment or an audit on them. That could
Okay.
be their insurance company, it could be somebody else in their supply chain, or it just simply asked for them to do this, right?
Yep.
And they did the assessment, or they looked and they said, wow, we really had no idea we needed to have this asset inventory system, or we needed to have threat detection. We don't even know what that is, and we've certainly never considered it for our OT system. Why does our DCS system or our PLC need to be assessed for threats? And
Okay.
so they'll call us in and they'll say, hey, can you help us out here? And we'll do an assessment. We'll come in. We're happy to do an assessment and take a look at that. But to be honest with you, 99.9% of the what we call critical infrastructure systems, right? So DHS classifies about 17 or 16 different sectors of critical infrastructure, and most manufacturers fall under that category. They almost all have the same big three needs. Number one is an asset inventory. They don't really know what they've got in their manufacturing spaces. They don't know all the PLCs and HMIs and smart transmitters and things they have in the environment. Number two, they're lacking risk management that we talked about. They don't know how to quantify cyber risk and especially cyber risk to their environment. And then the third big one is process and procedures. We all have this tribal knowledge. We all kind of know how to do the stuff we do, but the problem comes in, especially when you're in an emergency situation, or you're trying to train outside people, bring outside people. If it isn't written down, if it isn't documented, if you can't repeat it, I don't want to say it's worthless, but it's definitely of less value. And so what we found through repeated assessments is those three are always near the top of the list for our manufacturing and critical infrastructure standards.
I see. Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. So then how about the story of somebody that had a pretty major issue pop up and they reached out to you?
So we had I'm trying to think a couple of stories. So we actually had a customer who had ransomware. They had an event. They called us up and they said, hey, we really need you to take a look at this. We came in, we took a look at everything. One of the bigger ones, I think, that's more in line with what you guys are looking for. We had a major manufacturer. They produce emergency systems for Department of Defense, for hospitals, for these guys. And they said, hey, we'd like you to come in and just do an assessment for us. And we came in, and part of our assessment was actually doing it's a vulnerability scan. So it just looks at their systems, their computers, all of their controllers, and it looks against basically a known list of vulnerabilities that are published by government agencies, by private sector. And what we found was their emergency systems, their emergency power systems, were susceptible to what was called, actually, it was Blue Keep. It was a vulnerability that the NSA actually developed and was on these operating systems that allowed a bad actor to completely take control of the system, 100%.
Oh, wow.
And these systems were deployed, like we said, they were deployed at military bases, they were deployed in hospitals, they were deployed in data centers. So this was a huge deal, right? They had to recall these systems, they had to emergency develop a patch for this and put it out. And unfortunately, to our knowledge, this was never exploited in the wild. So it was a big find. It really was. And then after that, they were like, yeah, we would really like you guys to stick around and do more work with us.
I'm sure. So, all that's theoretical in nature because obviously the vulnerability exists. Um, if I'm the manufacturing owner sitting there, I may say, how often do these things really happen? Like, how often do you get a mid-sized manufacturer that, because they have a PLC that was somewhat insecure, in the information transfer, like they got hacked or whatever? Like, is this a common thing?
It's getting more common, right? I don't have the numbers sitting in front of me, but like literally today, I don't know what day this is actually going to come out, but today is Thursday. And every Tuesday and Thursday, CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, they publish a list of the industrial cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today happens to be what we affectionately refer to as Siemens Thursday. So one Thursday a month, they publish all the vulnerabilities known for Siemens, which is the largest control system in the world.
Right.
Rockwell is the biggest in the United States. Siemens is the biggest in the world. So Siemens Thursdays, there's always a massive number. Today, there were 32 vulnerabilities disclosed, right? Um, all but one of them were either Rockwell or Siemens. And so the bad guys, traditionally, they've looked for IT systems, right? They've looked for vulnerabilities in banking. They've looked for vulnerabilities in financial systems. But, and I mean, we could, philosophically debate when the turn started. I mean, some people will say with Stuxnet, some people will say with Black Ice. There's other specific OT attacks out there, but definitely when I would say the last 5 years, um, these what we call APTs, advanced persistent threats. So think nation states, think well-funded, highly motivated attackers have been paying more and more attention to PLCs, DCS, and SCADAs. And they're actually going out and they're buying these systems. They're buying these $100,000 packages, and they're learning everything they can about them and finding vulnerabilities in them, and then they're going out and exploiting them.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
in the U.S., it's still relatively rare compared to the rest of the world, but there are certain sectors, water, healthcare, and K through 12 education are particularly susceptible. I think most people remember the Colonial Pipeline accident or breach from, I think it was 2021,
Right.
where almost the entire east coast of the United States was shut down. The pipeline along the east coast was shut down due to a ransomware event. And that didn't specifically target OT systems, but OT paid the price for that because of what happened. And one of the things we talk about in OT is that um, no matter what it is, there's always an HSE component to OT cybersecurity, a health, safety, and environmental component. One of the guys on my team kind of jokingly says, nobody's email server ever killed anybody. And he's right, right? There are massive financial implications of IT issues. But at the end of the day, most of us don't have to worry about our desktop computer jumping up and attacking us or slamming a door shut on us. In OT, we do have to worry about that, right? Most
Right.
of us that work in manufacturing, they work in these environments. There's real hazards to our individual health and safety. And a lot of us have stuff. We work with sulfur dioxide. We work with chemicals that get put into the water, potentially stuff into the air. So there's real world impact of these systems that really, I mean, if you discharge to the water, does it matter if you discharge to the water because a valve failed or because somebody behind a keyboard in a foreign nation, hacked into your system and opened up the valve manually? The result is still the same.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, Joe, what are the components? Where do manufacturers usually find these, PLCs or other computers or information collection technologies? Where are they typically located? That some of these vulnerabilities are occurring.
Yeah, so a lot of times when we think of vulnerabilities, we think like Windows vulnerabilities, right? Most of us own Windows computers at home, and we know about patching our computers at home. We think about that. Occasionally, we'll read, or every once in a blue moon, one of these will make it to the national media. But the reality is, a PLC, a DCS, a network switch, they're all computers, right? There's some of them are more specialized in what they do than others, but they're all computers, and they are all susceptible to these exploits that these bad guys are using. So the firmware of a controller, of a PLC, of one of the controllers in a DCS or SCADA system can have vulnerabilities in it. The firmware of a switch or a network device can have vulnerabilities in it. The operating system, like Windows or Linux or Mac, that can have vulnerabilities in it. Your applications can have vulnerabilities in them. So a web application that we use or a thick application, think Microsoft Office, Excel, they can have vulnerabilities in them. Almost any of the utilities, we've even seen vulnerabilities in the processors themselves that make up our computers, right? Whether that's a laptop, a PC, or the processor that's inside of a controller. Those can even have vulnerabilities. So they're basically, if it can think like a computer, it can have a vulnerability in it. In terms of finding where those vulnerabilities are at, there's two major sources we use. The first is CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency. They keep a pretty good list of the vulnerabilities that are out there. They do some of their own research, but for the most part, they rely on industry researchers who then report it to CISA. And the other big one is the National Vulnerability Database, NVD. They do a pretty good job there. More and more, we're finding the vendors themselves are doing security testing and self-reporting some of this stuff. But for most of them, that winds up in the National Vulnerability Database anyway. You just might get a little bit of a heads up. So if you have a Rockwell controller or you have a Honeywell controller, for example, a lot of times you'll get maybe a 30-day advance notice that, hey, we've discovered this vulnerability. We're going to be putting it out publicly in another month or so. We're just giving you a heads up that you have it, and here's what we recommend to remediate it. It usually involves maybe deploying a patch or doing a small upgrade.
I see. So, there's very few people that are experts about cybersecurity or IT other than the professionals themselves. The rest of us are just kind of like, I think it's covered. So I have to assume that a lot of owners out there, a lot of, CEOs or maybe the CTO would know. But if you're in the position where you've hired an IT company and you think that you're covered with cybersecurity, you think you're good to go, and this talk gets them wondering a little bit, like, I wonder if I am covered. I wonder if these different aspects of OT are covered. What questions could they ask their IT company to assess whether or not they are being, cautious and knowing that they're covering the right thing?
The first thing is scoping questions, right? So you ask your IT service provider, within my plant or my enterprise, what do you guys cover? Most of the time these days, there's a separation, in your environment, your network environment we're talking right now, between your IT systems and your OT systems. That separation may be as simple as just a firewall between the IT and the OT. It may be more complex. There may actually be networks that are commonly referred to as DMZs that sit between. And asking the the IT manager, like, hey, do you guys help with the security of our DMZs, our OT systems? And if they ask you what's OT, that's not a good start. I'll tell you that much right now.
Right.
Even that is a little bit of a nebulous term. Sometimes people have different definitions of what's OT. But the easiest thing to ask is to say, hey, my HMIs, my PLCs, do you guys help with the security of that? Sometimes they do. Sometimes your vendors will help with that. So if you're a Rockwell shop, you got a lot of Rockwell PLCs, you may have an integrator or support group that handles the Rockwell stuff. So the question wouldn't be so much directed at your IT group. It would be, directed towards your instrumentation techs, your process control engineers, your automation control group, and ask them, hey, is vendor X who comes out and maintains this system, are they thinking about cybersecurity? Are they doing, keeping that cognizant when they're doing their work?
I see. And you said before that, a firewall isn't enough, right? So are we talking about the firewall between the OT and the
The IT?
Yeah, the IT.
We're actually talking both, right? Ideally, there's a minimum of 2 firewalls in your environment. One that separates the IT from the internet, and a second one
Right.
that separates the IT from the OT.
Right.
And part of my job is fighting the false truth, the fake news, the misinformation of you've got a firewall, that's fine. You don't need any other protective measures. You don't need to be doing patching or any of that fun stuff in OT. So there's 3 truths you need to understand about a firewall. Number one, like all this other stuff we've talked about, it's just a computer. It can have vulnerabilities the same as anything else. There are vulnerabilities in Cisco's ASAs, in Fortinet firewalls, in the Palo Altos. All of those guys have vulnerabilities. So if there's a vulnerability in your firewall, not only could the vulnerability potentially be used to bypass your firewall, the vulnerability could be used to turn your firewall into an attacker against the rest of your OT environment. So that's rule number one. Firewalls are just computers. Rule number 2 is that a firewall only does what you tell it to do. It's basically made up of a list. I mean, think about it as the bouncer who's got the list of who's allowed into the club.
Right.
And if the firewall rule says I'm going to allow web traffic, right, HTTP, to come through this firewall and get to a web server in OT, if that web server has vulnerabilities, the firewall is not going to protect you from that.
Right.
So if you've got a gang member that you're letting into your club, it doesn't help you, right? The bouncer's not going to do much for you there.
Right.
So firewall just does what it's told to do. Won't protect you from vulnerabilities behind the firewall that you allow access to. And then finally, the third thing I tell people is human beings configure the firewall. AI has not gotten good enough that it can completely configure a firewall for you. So for right now, human beings are configuring the firewall. And all human beings can make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
There can be misconfigurations in your firewall that inadvertently expose something they're not supposed to, or inadvertently allow something through that's not supposed to. So between firewall's just a computer, it does what you tell it to do, and it can be misconfigured. There are a lot of ways that you can defeat a firewall.
I see. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of a scary world. And I don't know if you're seeing this, but I would assume that the advanced nature of AI and large language models has changed the hacking landscape. Are they becoming more advanced? You're seeing new things pop up that you never expected to see?
There is. So AI is helping both sides, right? From the defensive side, AI, one of the big things we do, we literally generate hundreds of thousands of logs per minute, sometimes per second in our environment, depending on the size of your environment. And those logs are sometimes it's not the needle in the haystack, it's the needle in the sack of needles, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're looking for 1, 2, 3 entries that maybe came from 3 or 4 different locations to say, something is going on. And manually going through that process and manually finding those things is almost impossible, right? It's usually an after the fact type thing. We got hit. Let's go back and look. Now we know what we're looking for.
Right.
Let's go back and look, and okay, there's what there was. Now we see it now.
Yep.
AI can help the defenders in looking through those logs near instantaneously and helping you identify stuff that's going on while it's going on, or ideally before the trigger gets pulled on the bad stuff.
Right.
On the other side, AI is helping the bad guys automate their tasks, expedite their tasks, and it's also giving there's a layer of hackers. We the kind of the disparaging name of them is script kiddies, right? They're people who don't necessarily have a ton of skills. They're not writing malware from scratch, but they find somebody else's code, somebody else's malware, and they modify it a little bit and they put it in place. AI is helping those people write better code and write code that can get around your defenses even better.
Mm-hmm.
So it's both sides are benefiting from AI. The problem is that on the blue side, on the defensive side, we have to be right every time. On the red side, the attacking side, they only have to be right one time.
Right.
The analogy I always use for cybersecurity, I'm a sports guy. I like sports analogies. I say being a defensive person in cybersecurity is like being a defensive back in the NFL. you study, you watch film, you look at tendencies, you try to prepare as much as possible. But at the end of the day, whether or not you get the big contract is based on your reaction time. When the receiver breaks, how quickly can you close the gap and get back to the ball and knock it down or prevent that receiver from catching the ball?
Right.
That's really what it comes down to. You prepare as much as possible, but a lot of it is still reactionary.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So I had a question but I got wrapped into your excellent analogy and completely lost.
Yeah, sorry about that.
What I was going to say. So I guess what is if somebody was listening, they were concerned, what's the next step for them? Do you engage any size company? Is there any, too big, too small?
No. We engage the smallest companies all the way up to, like, say, Fortune 500 companies that multiple continents. The first thing, if you're just starting out, like if this is the first time you've heard OT cybersecurity, it's probably to do an assessment. We go off of NIST, we go off what's called the NIST cybersecurity framework. I think it's a very well laid out logical progression of how to go from the very beginning, which is asset inventory, all to the way to the very end, which is dealing with public relations and fallouts of an incident. But there's other standards out there as well. ISO and ISA are probably two of the biggest ones people have heard of.
Right.
Start with an assessment. Figure out where you're at today. So here's the spoiler alert, is that if you're just starting out, you're probably not going to score very well on an assessment.
Sure.
That's okay. The purpose is not to pass or fail. The purpose is to identify the areas where you need to focus your resources.
Right.
We have a saying internally, cybersecurity is a process, not a project. So it's not something that you do and you work on it for 12 to 16 months and you say, okay, we're done. I'm glad we don't have to do that again. No, it's a life cycle. It's an ongoing process.
Right.
And so the idea is to help you figure out, all right, you may not realize it, but you've got Excel spreadsheets running around out there that have a pretty good asset inventory, and you're sending your people out to look at them, quarterly or so. So maybe we can make do with the asset inventory today, but you've never really assigned criticality or figured out that this line makes 80% of our revenue for each year, and so we really want to worry about that line versus these other two lines that if one of those went down, it'd be rough, but nowhere near as bad as this line. So you start trying to figure out what's my priorities, what's my criticality, so that, in an ideal world, we'd all be flush with cash and we'd all have all the people we need and we'd go do all the things in cybersecurity at the same time. We don't live in that world.
Right.
So we have limited funds, we have limited people. We have to decide where are we going to focus those efforts, and the assessment is to help you figure that out.
Gotcha. Okay. I did finally remember what I was going to ask you.
Sure.
So you mentioned, when you get these vulnerability assessments that come out, they say, here's all the cybersecurity threats that we've seen pop up, and you mentioned two brands in specific. Do you find
Rockwell and Siemens?
Do you find that? Are there any warnings you could issue as far as purchasing specific pieces of technology or equipment? You're seeing a lot with a couple specific use cases.
I don't want people from Siemens and Rockwell calling me up, burning my house down. Right here, the reality of the situation is, those two are the biggest players in the game, so there's going to be more eyes on them.
Sure.
So there's more vulnerabilities disclosed in them because they've got a bigger footprint. More people are looking at them.
Right.
There's no one that I'm going to tell you, oh, this is the greatest ever. They don't have any vulnerabilities. Your supply chain, actually, there's an entire portion of the NIST cybersecurity framework around supply chain management, supply chain risk, right? You want to query your suppliers and understand, is cybersecurity a priority for them,
mm-hmm.
right? And that's not just your Siemens and your Rockwells, but that's your integrators as well. You want to, and this doesn't have to be massive, multi-month investigations. These can be simple questions of, hey, when our equipment, when we send a piece of equipment out to your factory for repair, can you guarantee that only certain text will work on it, so that there's no opportunity for someone to slip something malicious into it? Do you vet your employees? Do you guys follow a cybersecurity program? Do you guys do assessments internally? More and more, especially we see this with like life sciences, power, where there's regulated industries.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty good fortresses. It's difficult for a bad actor to get directly into them. So the bad actors are leveraging the support companies around them,
Right.
companies like us, like EIS, the integrators who do the stuff, and they're trying to find avenues through the supply chain to get in. One of the big ones people may have heard of was SolarWinds. More recently was CrowdStrike, right? There was a big, this was not a cyber event, or it wasn't a cyber attack, but it was a bad update that got pushed up in through CrowdStrike software, and it wound up affecting thousands of companies around the world. That's a supply chain attack, is what that is. And sometimes bad actors do that intentionally. The SolarWinds was definitely a bad actors thing, where they got into a SolarWinds update. It got pushed out to all these companies, some of which were federal companies, and they were able to gain access to that. So you've got to be cognizant of your suppliers, where they're coming from, and at least do your due diligence that they're doing something around cybersecurity and they're thinking about it as well.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I think this is a great conversation to have, because at least it gets people thinking about some of these things a little bit more, where it's probably pretty easy to push this stuff to the back of your mind when you're worried about production, kind of that
It is.
backwards triad, right?
The other big thing is always funding, right? Where's the funding source going to come from this? Because it's pretty easy in IT. Cybersecurity is an IT function, so it typically comes out of the IT budget, out of that side. But OT, it's not quite as clear. Rarely does IT actually want to cut funding and cover OT cybersecurity. So a lot of times what we're doing is we're having to go to an operations manager, we're having to go to a plant manager, and we're having to say, hey, we want you to cut so many dollars, so much percentage out of your operations budget that we absolutely know can be used to buy new equipment, to improve efficiency, to definitely increase your bottom line. And all I can do is tell you maybe something won't happen, right? I'm keenly aware of that. I absolutely know that's what we're doing.
Right.
The problem is if it does happen, it's going to be orders of magnitude more than what I'm asking you to spend. I think the last number I saw across all industries, I think the average ransomware event now is like $186,000. That's just for the ransom ask. That doesn't include downtime, reputational loss, additional labor that has to be brought in to deal with the issue. So I think it's about $200K now, average across the board.
Wow.
One of the big pharma companies got hit a number of years ago, and this has been tied up in litigation for a decade. They got hit with WannaCry, I believe it was, and they were down at least partially for like 6 months. Operator stations were down, everything was down. And at the end of all this, they had cyber insurance, and so they filed a claim for cyber insurance, and the insurance company refused to pay. Their reasoning behind it was because the attacker was a Russian-based outfit. The insurance company said this was an act of war, and we don't have to pay under the act of war clause. And the latest I heard, the initial court ruling agreed with the insurance company. Said, you're right, this was an act of war, you don't have to pay. And then on appeals, the appeals court reversed, and I think they settled out of court. But the numbers they were talking about was like $1.7 billion on that one.
That's why they're trying to get out of paying.
That's exactly right.
They're going to try anything.
These numbers get bigger, they get more frequent, and man, I don't want to, we call it FUD in the industry, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I don't want to be up here and just, be doom and gloom, right? Because what you wind up doing is you push people into an area where they go, well, you know what, I got no chance, so I'm just going to do nothing. Mm-hmm. The name of the game is make yourself an unappealing target.
Right. Don't be the slowest antelope in the pack when the lion.
Exactly. I love my analogies, right? So let's say you're a burglar and you're looking at two houses. One house over here has got this massive dog out front. Looks like he might have rabies. There's thick iron gates on the windows. The door looks to be made out of reinforced steel, and I can see at least 3 locks on it. It's lit up like a mall parking lot, right? And on the other side, I see a house like the curtains are wide open. I can see an 80-inch big screen TV inside. It's dark as a haunted house. The door might actually be open a little bit. And if I'm gonna rob one of those places, which one am I gonna go to? I'm gonna likely choose the one that looks like the easier target.
Right. Yep.
And for most of these bad guys, it's the same mentality. They're looking for easier targets.
Right.
So if you have some defenses, if there's some, I'd say you just don't have, like you said, you don't have to be just don't be the slowest antelope. If you have some defenses in place and you are a more difficult target, more than likely the bad guys are just going to move on to somebody else.
Right. Yeah, I think that's great advice. Yeah, and that applies in a lot of different areas. We even have, we have this issue in web development, which is the web accessibility WCAG, which these standards can be pretty stringent, but there's different levels for it. And I advise people, listen, you're basically trying to avoid some shady lawyer looking for a class action lawsuit suing you. So like if you cover the basics, I think they're going to move on. They're going to go after somebody much easier than. But yeah, it's unfortunate, that we have to deal with this crap, and it's only getting more prevalent and worse. And I even have customers that have been shut down because of a ransomware issue. But yeah, it's something we have to think about, because it could shut you down for 6 months. It should shut you down for a year. And like you said, not to be a fearmonger, but that's reality.
There's a couple of companies in the UK that recently folded. They're done. They had to pay ransom, couldn't recover from it, and they went bankrupt. Right? I think they're smaller retail sector places.
Yep.
But the threat is very real for anybody. I mean, if you're a smaller, 10, 15, 25 person, manufacturing shop, and conversely, a lot of times the smaller, the SMBs are sometimes more at risk. Not because they got deeper pockets, but because they don't necessarily have the better defenses. Like we said, the name of the game is don't be the slowest antelope. And so these guys don't necessarily have the resources, the knowledge, the financial pockets to be able to put the best defenses in place. And so they're easy targets for the bad guys. And for some of these outfits, a $200,000 ransom is the end of their business. Right. They wouldn't survive that.
Right. Well, great stuff to think about, Joe. You're obviously very knowledgeable in the space. I really appreciate your insight on this. I think it'd be helpful for a lot of companies to hear. But thanks a lot for coming on today.
One last thing I would say. So I'm ex-military. I view what I do in this space as a little bit of an extension of my military service. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of altruism to the work that I do. Obviously, if somebody's interested in doing something in OT cybersecurity, I'd love for them to give me a call. Let us have the business and let's do it. But the biggest thing I would say is please do something. Even if you don't use us, please find someone, do something, protect yourself. The last thing, I don't like these guys. They're bullies, they're thieves, and I don't like either one of those. Yeah. I don't want to see a customer or somebody I talk to wind up in the news because they got hit by ransomware.
Yeah.
So please do something. Protect yourself.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for your service. I think we talked about that. Were you Navy?
Navy.
That's
right. I was Navy.
Yep. Marine Corps for me. But yeah, no, I appreciate that perspective, and I feel the same way. Like it just pisses you off, right? That these people exist, and you want to not only shut them down but make them pay. I'd love to have a company that tracked them down physically and neutralized the threat, baby.
Again, another one of my analogies, I tell, when we get these big vulnerability notices like today, where there's like 40 or 50 vulnerability notices, I feel like Captain America at the end of Endgame, just standing there by myself with Thanos' army arrayed before me. And just kind of sigh a little bit, you put your head down, you tighten up your shield, and you just, I can do this all day.
That's awesome.
Apologies to Marvel.
Well, I think that's great. You're obviously passionate about what you do, and it's always good to see.
Very much so.
But all right, Joe, thanks a lot. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, man.